Last year, China decided to ban effeminate men from TV. What does this mean and why might they have done this? With the recent popularity of East Asian media, I think the divide between East Asian masculine ideals and Western ideals are becoming more and more apparent. The ideal man from the West is often represented through Captain America or Jason Momoa. And in East Asia, the ideal man is reflected through celebrities and idols like BTS, wen-wu, and Luhan. Now, this comparison was just to illustrate the differences in ideals. There's nothing right or wrong about either representation of masculinity. However, there's always been a stereotype that Asian men are more feminine, and this is because Western ideals of masculinity are usually seen as the norm. But why is it even the norm? As a result, and as Edward Said had succinctly put it, the Orient is feminized to such an extent that it is penetrated, silenced, and possessed. Because of what we said above and how often when we look at masculinity, we're always using the Western ideal as the norm, we're always thinking about default masculinity as men who are really macho, who are really aggressive or assertive, they're bold, they're dominant, especially amongst other men. We need to kind of step back from that sort of thinking and really look at masculinity specific to different cultures, because masculinity is a cultural construct. So it's only through understanding a culture and its history that we can really see how masculine ideals from different places have formed. So in exploring Chinese masculinity, I need to introduce to you the wen-wu paradigm. This essentially defines Chinese masculinity into two ideals, and it's made up of two Chinese characters which low-key mean like totally opposite things. Wen is like the literary side, referring to cultural attainment, so think scholars. And the second masculine ideal is wu, relating to martial valor. So this is, in a classical sense, all about military achievements. So we can think soldiers here. Straight away, we can see that these two ideals are pretty much on opposite sides of the spectrum. One side is all about being cultured, well-versed in the classics, and educated through books, poetry, and the likes. And the other is related to martial valor and military achievements. And so we can see already the existence of a masculine ideal that we don't really see in the West, the existence of Wen, of being a scholar. Moreover, what's interesting to note here is that in terms of Chinese masculinity, possessing Wen and being that scholar is no less manly than if you were a soldier. And in addition to that, honestly, a lot of the times Wen was seen as better than Wu. A large part of why Wen became so respected and viewed as a masculine ideal can be traced back to Confucius. In the Analects, Confucius actually acknowledges both Wen and Wu existing in men, although he did consider Wen to be superior, which is no surprise because he's like the god of Wen. Another reason why Wen plays such a big role in Chinese masculinity is due to the civil service exams in Imperial China. If you weren't born into a good family and you weren't like a nepotism baby, then doing well on this exam was one of the only ways to honorably move up the social ladder. In fact, if you have heard of the Gaokao, it's infamous for being one of the most stressful exams in the world, and that's very similar to this whole meritocracy argument, which was founded in Imperial China back when the civil service examination started. The civil service exams, in which you were tested on Confucius' writings, literally laid the groundwork for how modern China is run today. So we now know Confucius prioritized Wen and thought of this as the superior masculine ideal. But do we ever see Wu being prioritized? Well, to see this interesting shift in Wen and Wu values, we need to make a quick trip back to some of China's dynasties. Because these two ideals are so different, a lot of the times why one is more popular than the other can be explained through historical context. We start with the Tang dynasty, in which it was a Wu era. Bodily strength and athleticism was admired, and the ideal male lover during this time was a middle-aged man who kept thick beards. Fast forward to the Ming dynasty and we begin to see a shift. Athleticism was still admired, but one of the biggest differences was that we went from that middle-aged man who kept thick beards from the Tang dynasty into a more youthful lover, one who didn't keep facial hair. Then afterwards came the Qing dynasty and the Manchu occupation. This was when martial arts was essentially monopolized by the conquerors. As a result, civilians, and especially the literary class, thought of martial arts or Wu as distasteful and vulgar. Because of this, we begin to see a shift into Wen, and so the ideal male lover at this time morphs into a delicate youth, someone with a pale face, narrow shoulders, surrounded himself by books, and he would sigh at the slightest disappointment. So we could see Wen and Wu manifest in different historical eras, but we can actually see people embodying these traits too, like how Confucius was the embodiment of Wen, Some famous figures include Zhuge Liang and Guan Yu from Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Zhuge Liang was a bright military strategist who represented Wen, and Guan Yu was a famed general who represented Wu. In Water Margin, one of China's 4 literary greats, we have Wu Song representing Wu. And fun fact, the Wu in his name is the same Wu we've been referring to all along. He was a murderer turned bandit, so yeah, he represents Wu. And then we have Wu Yong, who was nicknamed Knowledgeable Star, and so he represents Wen, and he was a teacher turned bandit. But what's most interesting here is that though you have these 2 characters who represent the extremes of Wen or Wu, someone who's super smart and then someone who's like really good and famed for fighting, there is still someone above them, someone who's like the king, the general, or the leader. In Romance of the Three Kingdoms, above Zhuge Liang and Guan Yu stood Liu Bei, and in Water Margin, above Wu Song and Wu Yong stood Song Jiang, the chief bandit. But the interesting part here is that we can actually also apply this to real-world situations as well, because obviously wen-wu doesn't just exist in fictional works. If we look at the early years of the People's Republic of China, you have Liu Shaoqi being the administrator, representing Wen, and Zhu De being the general, representing Wu. And above the both of them was Mao Zedong, the chairman. So even though Chinese masculine ideals can be split between Wen and Wu, what's interesting is that the leader is usually said to possess both. So we can see that the idea of Wen and Wu are crucial to understanding traditional Chinese masculinity. But what's interesting about this is that though well documented, these ideals only represent what men thought the ideal man was. So does this change if we bring women into the picture? I can use 6 words to summarize this section, and that is the female gaze and supply and demand. We mentioned earlier that masculine ideals, though well documented through Wen and Wu, don't really reflect what females thought the ideal man should be like. However, this all changes in 1978 when China's economic reform happens. 2 things became different. First, China went from a centrally planned economy to a market-based one. And second, women joined the workforce, so they actually have purchasing power now because they have money. And so there are entire markets out there now with just the female demographic in mind. So what happens to depictions of men when there are genres that are targeted to women and made by women? One such genre that took off was the portrayal of Bishounen from Japanese mangas. Bishounen, meaning beautiful youth, generally featured boys that were, as the name suggests, beautiful. Now, this whole idea of beauty in men wasn't a foreign concept in China. In the Beijing opera, more effeminate men had traditionally been casted to play female roles. However, beauty being such a significant trait in men, like these men that just walk through the door and they're just beautiful, that type of beauty can be traced back to the Bishounen genre. And Japanese mangakas at this time seemed to take inspiration from international male icons with more feminine qualities, like Swedish actor Björn Andresen, who's often cited as a major source of inspiration for Bishounen characters. Perhaps even more exclusive to women though is a subgenre within Bishounen called boys love, BL, or danmei. And often a core characteristic of these stories is the presence of extremely beautiful, young, in the sense that they look young, because I know half the time in these novels, these characters are over 1,000 years old, and effeminate looking men. Now, whilst beauty isn't the end-all in these works, because some of these novels have the most intricate plots, beauty is definitely a major part of the character design. And alongside Bishounen influences, the Kunminam or flower boy image was also seeing more traction. Especially with K-pop, its influence in China really began in the 1990s when bilateral relations between the 2 countries were normalized in 1992. This allowed for more tourism between the 2 countries, and naturally businesses and students also followed suit, which allowed for the exchange of ideas and culture. Given this, China was really one of the first markets that K-pop broke through in. And the flower boy image we mentioned earlier is often said to be popularized by OG K-pop group H.O.T. Magazines featuring them would emphasize their edgy styling and choreo and their more effeminate appearances. From the influence of Japanese and Korean culture came the rise of xiao in China, which is literally translated to little fresh meat. I think I've become desensitized to the Chinese term, but every time I see the English translation, it takes me out for a second. This xiao term is often used to describe male actors which possess a sort of feminine beauty to them. Celebrities like Xiao Zhan, Wang Yibo, Lu Han, and Cai Xukun all fall under the xiao category. And I think it's also interesting that a lot of these xiao actors actually first started their careers in the Korean entertainment industry. I think this really shows the transnational trends that are forming and the crossover of different ideals. ideals. So with the rise of Bishounen and flower boys in the 1990s, we saw a softer, prettier masculine ideal emerge. Two quick notes on this. First, though Japan and Korea had a big influence on this portrayal of softer masculinity, it's not like this ideal didn't exist in China before. Depictions of caizi from the caizi jiaren literary genre popular in the Ming and Qing dynasties would feature this sort of softer masculine ideal. And second, because we've been talking about beauty so much, it's not that beauty has always been separate from masculinity, but rather it's just a more important trait now than it was before. And this sort of beauty is part of a transnational trend coined as the Pan-East Asian soft masculinity. And this period of time was when depictions of masculinity across China, Japan, and Korea was viewed as exceptionally feminine to the West. And of course, now that we bring the West in, I feel like this is an appropriate segue to talk about China and the government's stance on masculinity. The CPC made a move to denounce and even ban effeminate male actors from TV, as issued by the National Radio and Television Administration in September last year. They write a whole statement about this, but essentially in the statement, they refer to more effeminate men as "娘炮," which is a rather derogatory or insulting term, similar in meaning to the word sissy. Because we talked about pop culture just then, we're going to view this in relation to pop culture first, and then look at this decision more holistically. From a pop culture perspective, this more effeminate male image is tied to a lot of things, but especially the danmei or BL industry. And it's exactly as we mentioned earlier, it's because of this portrayal of beautiful men. So when any of these works get put on the big screen, the actors that are casted are usually more effeminate as well to fit in with the beauty standards. And the government's issue with this is really succinctly summarized by this one quote from Li Yanling, who says, "Women's obsession with danmei is treacherous to both the state and the patriarchy, as it touches upon all possible taboos in current China: pornography, the objectification of men, infertility, and homosexuality." But the image of more effeminate men obviously has wider ties than just danmei, as we mentioned earlier. And here's where it gets juicy, or messy depending on what kind of person you are, because a lot of the opinions related to this issue are spoken with a nationalistic view. A comment that was widely circulated regarding this was 少年娘则中国娘, which translates to young men being feminine today will lead to a more effeminate China tomorrow. The origin of this comment came from when France won the FIFA World Cup, and the post was showing Mbappe compared to the TF Boys, which is a popular Chinese boy band. The point that the post was making was that the men in this picture were both 19 years old, but somehow there was such a big difference because Mbappe, being a real man, led France to victory, whilst in China you have youths like the TF Boys, and that just leads to an effeminate China or a weak China. You know, something tells me that the original commenter was just salty that China hasn't made a single World Cup since 2002, but yeah, sure, blame it on effeminate men. What's most interesting about these nationalist remarks though is how paradoxical these sentiments are. You're fueled by nationalism, you're making a post on wanting to make China great again, but there's a clear sense of self-orientalism because in the same post, you're making Western masculine ideals as the norm, and you're pitting Chinese masculinity or yourself against it and posing it as inferior. So that's just one side of the coin, with the government straight up denouncing effeminate depictions of men. However, on the other side, as you might have already picked up on, has a lot to do with nationalism. In fact, the government has put in so much effort to make sure that being a real man includes doing what's good for the country. There are countless tales of men who have sacrificed themselves for their country, and this sacrifice and martyrdom has always been tied to masculinity. Therefore, you get sentiments like these when netizens comment, "It's hard to imagine such effeminate youth will be able to protect our country if an invasion looms." In fact, one delegate has said that the popularity of pretty boys in pop culture has now made boys weak, inferior, and timid. He also lamented that boys no longer wanted to be war heroes and warned that this could endanger the future of Chinese people. State-run media has also warned against the dangers of feminization, stating that this would prevent China's youth from reaching national rejuvenation as preached by Xi Jinping. So what does the CPC want masculinity to be? Well, the Ministry of Education stated that men should be muscular, reliable, and career-oriented providers. They also said that the masculine spirit requires physical and mental fitness as well as strong willpower. Xi Jinping has also commented that a nation is strong if its youth are strong, thereby reinforcing masculinity with toughness and strength, as well as condemning effeminate representations. And the clear disconnect between what the government wants masculinity to be and what society demands for it to be reveals a deep-seated anxiety over what a more effeminate younger generation will mean for China's future. So we've basically unpacked masculinity through the form of looking at traditional masculinity in the past, and then we took a look at modern masculinity in terms of how that's evolved currently, and now because of the government's intervention and direction, that kind of points towards an idea of what future masculinity will be like in China. And that was a lot. Now, because I love hearing about all of your thoughts, I posted a TikTok ahead of time talking about the depictions of East Asian and Western masculinity, and I'll be bouncing off some of the comments that you guys left there. To kick us off, we have a comment from Pepe who says, "It's really not quite as bad as people think it is though. There's still very many movie stars that represent a more masculine ideal in China." In this video, we talked about masculine ideals, which usually can be pinpointed down to one or two things because that's what every man should be trying to achieve. But in terms of how masculinity is really depicted and represented, that can take the form of so many different ways. For Chinese actors, this is no different. It's not like every Chinese actor is going to be xiao and embody that softer masculine image. There's definitely male actors that showcase a different side of masculinity, perhaps one that's more rugged or one that's more macho. If we go to watch a war film, the male lead is 100% going to look very different from the male lead in a rom-com. And in relation to xiao and masculinity, celebrities that we mentioned before like Cai Xukun have recently posted a picture of himself growing out a beard. So clearly the government's mandate is pushing masculinity towards a certain direction. And it's not just Cai Xukun, other celebrities like Tao, who was in EXO, have posted pictures of himself working out at the gym and showing off his muscles. In addition, I really wanted to include this comment because I think whenever we're doing like deep dives or looking at a specific ideal or a specific topic, it's easy to be really tunnel visioned on that particular thing. So I think Pepe's comment really shows that whilst feminine portrayals of masculinity is a big thing in China, it's definitely not the be all end all at all. So I thought that was a really good comment to keep in mind and also a great kickstarter to this conversation. Next, we have a comment from Yin who says, "True, but I also think that feminine type men are becoming more popular in the West, like Timothée Chalamet. I think women in general feel more safe than being with this macho type of guy that could kill you with one strangle. I mean, if we look at all the assaults done to women, we want a more kinder, softer looking guy." And there's a lot to unpack there, but it's a great comment. First of all, we're seeing more diversity in terms of how masculinity is expressed in the West as well. Yin is spot on by saying that there are more feminine depictions of masculinity come through. And some great examples are celebrities like Zayn, Harry Styles, and Timothée Chalamet, who kind of embody a softer masculine appeal. It's great to see more representation, and I think that the female gaze still plays a very big role in creating these new forms of masculinity. Yin's second comment on macho men is also something interesting to consider. Recently, I've been reading the picture of Dorian Gray, and I actually have it here with me on my desk. And because I was making this video, I actually came across a sentence and I just thought, wait, that's kind of relevant to this whole discussion. And to give you some context on the quote, it's basically this girl getting married and her brother is like, you know, if the guy that you're getting married ever hurts you, I'm gonna hurt him back. And obviously this sentiment isn't anything new, but what I found interesting is that the same dominance and violence that the brother is promising is also the cause of his concern. So what does that say about this ideal of masculinity? And in fact, what do we think about macho men? Is it more appealing now compared to before, or has it actually become less appealing? Let me know what your thoughts are on this macho type of masculinity. And finally, there's one more comment which I think sums up this video really nicely. It's by user 60137307435152, and they say, "This is what is meant by gender is a social construct. Each of them are men, but each culture defines what a man should be / how they should look." And I think that is just such a good summary because masculinity is a social and societal construct. What it meant in the past may not be how it's represented today, but looking at the past gives us that historical context into understanding how things might have evolved to be how they became today. And similarly, how masculinity is like now might not be how it's like in the future. That's just something we'll have to wait and see. The other point that I wanted to conclude on and emphasize is I feel like the Western ideal of masculinity has just been so dominant dominant to the point where a lot of the times we just default to viewing Western masculinity as synonymous to, I guess, universal masculinity ideals. And because Western masculinity is so dominant, not only do we compare differing depictions of masculinity to the Western one, using it as a norm, but we often try and understand and judge other cultures and their depictions of masculinity because it doesn't fit in with the one that we're used to. So hopefully in this video I was able to show you what Chinese masculinity is like and viewing it specifically through a Chinese lens instead of understanding it from a Western viewpoint. I hope you find this video informative, and yeah, please do let me know any thoughts you have on this topic. I would love to read it. And finally, I want to say a big thank you to everyone that has commented and watched my video so far. I am floored by the amount of support that I have received, so thank you so much once again. In the next video, I'll be looking at East Asian beauty standards and particularly on the use of filters. We all know apps like Snow and Mato are loved by so many users, specifically in East Asia, and with it comes a lot of consequences. So yeah, we'll be looking into that in the next video, and if you're interested, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on it. Thank you guys so much again for watching all the way until the end, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!